I'm going to tell you something uncomfortable that a lot of people only realize after the relationship is already broken. When a woman is preparing to emotionally leave a relationship, she usually does not announce it directly. She does not suddenly wake up one morning and become a completely different person overnight. Instead, the change starts quietly through small emotional shifts, new patterns, and certain phrases that sound harmless at first, but slowly change the entire emotional direction of the relationship. And if you do not understand the psychology behind those phrases, you can spend months trying to fix something that emotionally ended long before you realized it was slipping away. All right, welcome back. If you're new here, my name is Isabella, and this channel is all about female psychology, relationships, attraction, emotional behavior, and the hidden emotional patterns people usually notice too late. So if you enjoy these kinds of deep conversations, make sure you subscribe, because the videos on this channel are designed to help you understand relationship psychology on a much deeper level. Now let's get into this, because what I'm about to explain today is something many people completely miss while it is happening right in front of them. One thing people misunderstand about cheating is that it usually begins emotionally before it ever becomes physical. Long before another man enters the picture physically, emotional distance often starts building slowly inside the relationship. A woman begins disconnecting emotionally first, and that emotional disconnection starts showing itself through changes in communication, changes in behavior, and changes in emotional energy. And honestly, language reveals a lot more than people think. The phrases someone repeats consistently often expose what is happening emotionally underneath the surface. That is why today I'm going to break down 5 common lies, or phrases women sometimes use when they are emotionally checking out of a relationship or preparing themselves mentally for another emotional connection. Now, let me make something clear before people misunderstand this video. Not every woman who says these things is cheating. Not every emotional shift means betrayal. Sometimes people are genuinely stressed, emotionally confused, overwhelmed, or going through personal struggles. But psychology is about repeated patterns, not isolated moments. And when these phrases start appearing together with emotional distance, secrecy, loss of intimacy, sudden defensiveness, and emotional coldness, they often point toward deeper emotional separation already happening behind the scenes. Before we continue, comment below and tell me where you're watching from, because I always like seeing how far these conversations are reaching. The first lie sounds extremely reasonable on the surface, and honestly, that is why so many men ignore the warning signs connected to it for far too long. I've just been stressed lately. Now let's be fair, stress is real. Life becomes overwhelming sometimes. Work pressure, emotional exhaustion, family problems, mental health struggles, financial pressure, all of these things can absolutely affect a relationship temporarily. But the psychology becomes different when stress suddenly starts changing. Only the emotional connection between the two of you, while everything else in her life still seems emotionally active and energized. This is where many men start feeling confused, because the woman who once wanted closeness suddenly feels emotionally distant. Conversations become shorter. Physical affection decreases. Eye contact changes. Even simple things like cuddling, holding hands, random touching, or emotional warmth begin disappearing slowly. And every time you notice it, the answer becomes, "I'm just stressed." The dangerous part is that the explanation sounds mature and believable, so instead of paying attention to the pattern, many men start blaming themselves for even questioning it. But here is something important psychologically. When a woman is emotionally connected to a man, stress usually makes her want emotional comfort from him, not emotional distance from him. She may be tired physically, mentally drained, or emotionally overwhelmed. But deep down, she still seeks emotional safety, emotional support, and emotional closeness with the person she genuinely feels connected to. That is why emotional withdrawal matters so much. Because when stress becomes an excuse for complete emotional shutdown over a long period of time, something deeper is often happening underneath the surface emotionally. And another thing many men miss is behavioral contrast. She says she is emotionally exhausted around you, but suddenly she has energy for everything else. New hobbies, new attention to appearance, more time on her phone, more excitement socially, more emotional energy outside the relationship than inside it. This is where emotional redirection sometimes begins. And psychologically, emotional redirection happens when emotional investment starts moving away from the relationship and toward another emotional focus, whether that becomes another man emotionally, a fantasy, life, mentally, or simply emotional independence from the relationship itself. Now, again, this does not automatically prove cheating, but emotionally healthy relationships usually do not become emotionally cold only in one direction. That is the important difference. And honestly, one of the biggest mistakes men make during this stage is becoming desperate for reassurance instead of calmly observing the emotional pattern itself. Because once you start begging for emotional connection from someone already pulling away emotionally, the emotional balance inside the relationship changes completely. That is why emotional awareness matters more than emotional panic. You need to watch patterns, not excuses. The second lie sounds emotionally mature at first, which is exactly why it confuses so many men. I just need to focus on myself right now. Now, honestly, there is nothing wrong with personal growth. Healthy people should work on themselves emotionally, mentally, physically, and spiritually. The problem starts when self-growth suddenly becomes emotional separation disguised as personal development. This is where the psychology changes. A woman who still feels emotionally connected to you usually wants growth, to include the relationship in some way. She may want better communication, healthier habits, emotional healing, or more independence personally, but she still wants emotional partnership while growing. But when emotional distance begins forming underneath the relationship, the language starts changing differently. Suddenly, everything becomes about needing space away from you emotionally. She stops including you in her inner world. She becomes emotionally private. Conversations feel colder. You start hearing things like, "I need to find myself. I need space to think. I just want to focus on me for now." And every time you express confusion or emotional concern, you somehow become the problem for not supporting her growth. That is where many men get manipulated emotionally without realizing it. Because instead of paying attention to the emotional distance itself, they start feeling guilty for simply wanting emotional closeness with their partner. But psychologically, healthy growth inside relationships usually creates more emotional honesty, not emotional secrecy. That is the difference many people miss. And another thing important to understand is this. When someone emotionally prepares themselves to leave a relationship, they often start mentally separating their identity from the relationship first. They begin creating emotional independence internally before the actual breakup or betrayal ever happens physically. That is why the energy changes before the relationship officially ends. And honestly, this is where many men waste months trying to reconnect with someone already emotionally disconnecting in private. Not because they are weak, but because emotional changes happen gradually enough to create confusion instead of clarity. That is why you must pay attention to repeated emotional patterns instead of only listening to emotionally polished explanations. The third lie usually appears the moment you start noticing changes and asking normal questions about them. You're being too controlling. This is where many men begin doubting themselves emotionally because the conversation suddenly shifts away from her behavior and turns into an attack on your character instead. You ask why she has become emotionally distant. You ask why she hides her phone more now. You ask why she suddenly stays out later, acts colder, or becomes defensive over simple questions. And instead of calmly reassuring you, the conversation immediately flips into, "You don't trust me. You're insecure. You're controlling. You're suffocating me." Now let's be honest. Truly controlling behavior does exist. An unhealthy jealousy can absolutely damage relationships. But there is a massive difference between toxic control and reasonable emotional concern inside a committed relationship. Healthy couples naturally ask questions. Healthy couples communicate changes. Healthy couples reassure each other when emotional distance appears. That is normal relationship behavior. But psychologically, when someone becomes defensive over basic accountability, it often signals that the real issue is no longer the question itself. The issue is that your questions are getting too close to emotional truths they do not want exposed yet, and this is where emotional manipulation sometimes begins. Because instead of addressing your concern directly, the goal becomes making you feel guilty for even noticing the problem in the first place. Once guilt enters the conversation, many men immediately back down emotionally. They stop asking questions because they fear looking insecure or toxic. They start ignoring their instincts just to avoid conflict. That is dangerous psychologically, because when someone teaches you to distrust your own emotional awareness, you slowly lose confidence in your ability to recognize unhealthy behavior clearly. And honestly, emotionally healthy people usually want clarity inside relationships, not confusion. If your concern is reasonable, a healthy partner normally responds with openness, reassurance, and communication instead of immediate character attacks. That does not mean every concern proves cheating. But it does mean emotional defensiveness matters, especially when it appears together with secrecy, emotional distance, changed behavior, and sudden emotional coldness. Because patterns reveal emotional reality much more clearly than excuses ever will. The fourth lie is one of the most dangerous because it sounds caring, mature, and emotionally responsible on the surface. I just don't want to hurt you. Now, when men hear this, many immediately think the woman is being honest, thoughtful, or emotionally considerate. But psychologically, this phrase often appears when someone is already emotionally halfway out of the relationship and is trying to prepare you slowly for emotional pain they already know is coming. That is why the energy behind the sentence feels strange. It sounds soft, but emotionally distant at the same time. And honestly, many men ignore the deeper meaning because they focus only on the comforting tone instead of the emotional direction hidden underneath the words. Because think about it carefully. People who are fully emotionally committed usually focus on protecting the relationship together, but when someone repeatedly starts talking about not wanting to hurt you, they are often mentally preparing themselves for actions they know will eventually hurt you anyway. That is why this phrase creates emotional anxiety without clear explanation. Your instincts feel something changing emotionally, but the words themselves sound caring enough to confuse you. And this is where emotional attachment becomes dangerous. Because instead of accepting the emotional warning, many men start trying harder to save the relationship. They become more patient, more understanding, more emotionally available, hoping extra love will somehow reverse the emotional distance already building quietly underneath the surface. But emotional disconnection rarely gets fixed through desperation. In fact, desperation usually pushes emotional imbalance even further. And another thing many people miss is this: guilt often appears before betrayal becomes visible. When someone knows emotionally they are pulling away, hiding things, or developing emotional feelings elsewhere, guilt naturally starts leaking into their language. That guilt creates emotionally strange conversations. Suddenly, they become overly emotional, overly apologetic, overly reflective, almost like they are emotionally preparing you for disappointment before the truth fully arrives. Now again, this does not automatically prove cheating every single time, but psychologically, repeated emotional distancing mixed with guilty language often signals internal, emotional conflict already happening privately. And honestly, this is why emotional awareness matters so much in relationships. Because many people wait for physical proof, while ignoring emotional evidence that the relationship has already been quietly changing for a long time underneath the surface. The fifth lie is probably the most confusing one emotionally because it sounds positive instead of negative. I've just been thinking a lot lately. Now, on the surface, this sentence feels harmless. Everybody thinks deeply sometimes. People go through emotional phases, personal reflection, stress, or confusion about life. But psychologically, this phrase becomes very different when it starts appearing together with emotional distance, secrecy, and sudden changes in behavior inside the relationship. This is where many men feel something is wrong emotionally but cannot fully explain why. Because the woman is physically still there, but emotionally she feels somewhere else. Her attention feels divided. Her energy feels distracted. Conversations feel emotionally disconnected, even when she is sitting right next to you. And every time you notice it, the explanation becomes, "I'm just thinking a lot." But what many men fail to understand is that emotional withdrawal often begins mentally before it becomes physical. Long before someone officially leaves a relationship, they usually start emotionally processing another reality privately inside their mind. That is why emotional presence changes first. And honestly, this is one of the biggest signs emotional investment is shifting somewhere else psychologically. A woman who is mentally reconnecting emotionally with another possibility, another lifestyle, another emotional attachment, or another version of herself often becomes psychologically less present inside the current relationship. Her body stays. Her emotions slowly drift. And the dangerous part is that many men keep focusing only on what she says instead of observing the emotional atmosphere itself. Because emotionally healthy relationships usually feel emotionally connected, even during stressful periods. But when someone mentally checks out emotionally, the relationship starts feeling lonely, even before the breakup happens officially. And another thing important to understand is this. Emotional cheating often starts through imagination before action, fantasies, emotional curiosity, hidden emotional attachment, secret emotional comparisons. All of these things slowly weaken emotional loyalty internally, long before physical betrayal ever appears outwardly. That is why emotional distance matters psychologically. Because people rarely wake up one morning suddenly disconnected. Emotional separation usually builds slowly through repeated emotional withdrawal over time. And honestly, one of the biggest mistakes men make is ignoring emotional reality simply because physical proof has not appeared yet. But emotional patterns usually reveal the truth long before direct confession ever does. Now, here is the part many people struggle to accept emotionally. The problem is not only the lies themselves. The real danger is what happens to you psychologically when you keep hearing them repeatedly while trying to hold the relationship together at the same time. Because slowly, your emotional reality starts changing too. At first, you notice the distance clearly. You feel the coldness. You feel the change in energy. Your instincts warn you that something is wrong. But after weeks or months of excuses, defensiveness, emotional confusion, and mixed signals, you start doubting your own judgment instead. That is where emotional manipulation becomes extremely damaging psychologically. You stop trusting your instincts. You stop asking questions. You stop expressing concerns because every conversation somehow turns into you feeling guilty, insecure, toxic, or emotionally exhausting. And little by little, your emotional confidence disappears. This is why many men become emotionally anxious during this stage of a relationship. Their nervous system stays emotionally alert constantly because nothing feels emotionally stable anymore. One day she feels warm. The next day she feels emotionally cold. One moment she acts loving. The next moment she feels emotionally unavailable, and because the emotional pattern keeps changing, your brain becomes obsessed with trying to fix the relationship emotionally. That creates emotional exhaustion. And honestly, this is where many men lose themselves without realizing it. They become emotionally reactive, emotionally desperate, emotionally dependent on small moments of reassurance. They start accepting emotional breadcrumbs because they are terrified of losing the relationship completely. But healthy relationships should not constantly force you into emotional survival mode. Real emotional connection creates stability, not constant confusion. And this is something emotionally mature people eventually learn the hard way. Love cannot survive properly when honesty disappears. The moment secrecy, emotional manipulation, guilt tactics, and emotional withdrawal become normal patterns, the relationship slowly stops feeling emotionally safe for both people. That is why awareness matters so much. Not paranoia, not toxic suspicion. Awareness. Because emotionally aware, people pay attention to repeated patterns instead of ignoring reality, simply because they are emotionally attached. And honestly, attachment blinds people more than almost anything else in relationships. Once you deeply love someone, your brain naturally wants to protect the connection, even when the connection itself is slowly damaging your emotional peace underneath the surface. One of the biggest mistakes people make during emotional betrayal is waiting too long to accept what the relationship already feels like emotionally. They keep searching for perfect proof while ignoring the emotional reality happening in front of them every single day. And honestly, emotional reality matters. Because relationships are not built only on words. They are built on emotional presence, emotional consistency, trust, openness, and emotional safety. Once those things start disappearing repeatedly, the relationship naturally starts feeling emotionally unstable, no matter how many explanations are given afterward. This is why your emotional state inside the relationship tells you more truth than people realize. If you constantly feel anxious, emotionally confused, emotionally disconnected, or mentally exhausted around someone, your nervous system is already reacting to the emotional environment around you. That reaction matters psychologically. And another thing many men misunderstand is this. When a woman is emotionally invested in the relationship, she usually tries to protect emotional closeness naturally, even during arguments, stress, or difficult periods. There is still emotional effort to reconnect, reassure, and repair the emotional bond. But when emotional investment starts shifting elsewhere, the energy changes completely. Now, emotional closeness feels forced. Communication feels colder. Your attention feels unwanted instead of appreciated. And every attempt to reconnect emotionally starts feeling one-sided. That imbalance slowly destroys emotional trust. And honestly, this is why emotional patterns matter more than isolated emotional moments. Anybody can temporarily act loving during emotional guilt, fear of losing the relationship, or moments of emotional loneliness. But consistent emotional behavior always reveals the deeper truth underneath. That is why emotionally mature people stop focusing only on promises and start observing emotional consistency instead, because consistency reveals emotional direction. And here is something many people learn too late. You cannot force emotional loyalty from someone already emotionally disconnecting internally. The more desperately you chase emotional closeness during that stage, the more emotionally drained you often become yourself. That is why self-respect matters so much psychologically. At some point, protecting your emotional peace becomes more important than endlessly trying to save a relationship where honesty, trust, and emotional connection are already disappearing underneath the surface. And honestly, accepting emotional reality early usually hurts less than spending years emotionally attached to denial. Another thing people rarely talk about is how emotional betrayal changes a person mentally, even before the relationship officially ends. When someone you love starts becoming emotionally distant, secretive, cold, or emotionally inconsistent, your entire emotional balance slowly starts shifting too. You begin overthinking constantly. Small things suddenly affect your mood. A delayed text changes your emotional state. A change in tone makes you anxious. You start searching for reassurance everywhere, because deep down your nervous system already feels the emotional instability growing inside the relationship. And honestly, this is why emotionally unhealthy relationships become mentally exhausting. Your brain never fully relaxes anymore. You are constantly trying to read emotional signals, predict emotional changes, and protect yourself from emotional pain before it fully arrives. That creates emotional hypervigilance. And emotional hypervigilance slowly drains your confidence, peace, focus, and emotional stability over time. This is why many men become emotionally obsessed during this stage instead of emotionally clear. They spend so much energy trying to understand what changed that they stop asking a more important question. Is this relationship still emotionally healthy for me at all? Because once emotional trust starts collapsing repeatedly, love alone usually cannot repair the damage by itself. Trust is emotional safety. Without emotional safety, relationships slowly turn into emotional survival instead of emotional partnership. And another thing many people miss is this. Someone emotionally disconnecting from you often starts emotionally justifying their behavior privately, long before you fully understand what is happening. That is why their energy changes before the truth becomes visible outwardly. The guilt changes them. The secrecy changes them. The emotional conflict changes them. And you feel that emotional shift even when you cannot explain it logically yet. That is why instincts matter more than people realize psychologically. Not irrational jealousy, not toxic suspicion, but repeated emotional discomfort mixed with repeated behavioral changes. Because healthy relationships usually feel emotionally open, emotionally calm, and emotionally stable most of the time. They do not constantly leave one person confused, anxious, emotionally neglected, and mentally exhausted, trying to hold everything together alone. And honestly, one of the hardest truths in relationships is accepting when someone has emotionally left before physically leaving. Because emotionally, the relationship often ends long before the official breakup or betrayal ever becomes visible publicly. At the end of the day, the biggest mistake people make is ignoring emotional reality because they are emotionally attached to the version of the relationship they want to believe still exists. They keep hoping things will magically return to how they used to feel, even when the emotional connection has clearly been changing for a long time underneath the surface. And honestly, hope can blind people emotionally. Because when you deeply love someone, your brain naturally wants to protect the relationship. You focus on good memories, old emotional moments, temporary improvements, and small signs of affection while ignoring the repeated emotional patterns quietly destroying your peace at the same time. But emotionally mature people eventually learn something difficult. Real relationships cannot survive properly without honesty, emotional consistency, trust, and emotional openness. Once secrecy, manipulation, emotional withdrawal, and emotional distance become normal patterns, the relationship slowly stops feeling emotionally safe. That is why awareness matters so much. Not paranoia, not toxic control. Awareness. Because emotionally aware, people pay attention to repeated emotional behavior instead of only listening to emotionally polished explanations. They observe actions, emotional consistency, communication patterns, and emotional effort over time. And honestly, this is where many people finally realize they were trying to save a relationship alone while the other person was already emotionally leaving privately. That imbalance destroys emotional stability slowly. You become emotionally drained, trying to reconnect with someone emotionally disconnecting from you at the same time. And the longer it continues, the more damage it does to your confidence, self-respect, and emotional peace. That is why protecting your emotional health matters so much in relationships. Love should not constantly leave you anxious, emotionally confused, emotionally exhausted, and mentally unstable. Healthy relationships create emotional safety more often than emotional fear. And here is the truth many people need to hear clearly. Walking away from emotional manipulation or emotional dishonesty is not weakness. Sometimes it is the strongest thing a person can do psychologically because it means you finally chose emotional truth over emotional attachment. If you made it all the way to the end, comment, "I watched till the end" below so I know who stayed for the full conversation. And before you leave, make sure you like this video, subscribe, and turn on notifications, because I'll be posting more videos every week on female psychology, relationships, attraction, emotional behavior, and the hidden emotional patterns most people notice too late.